Today, all over the planet, in virtually every nation, using virtually every language, millions upon millions are gathering. And they're gathering to celebrate what we all know is impossible. That a man, after being dead 3 days, was raised to life. Now, that same man taught some incredible things. He believed in the impossible. He taught all kinds of crazy stuff. Stuff that initially people didn't take very seriously. And today I want to think about one of the things that he taught. Jesus invited his followers, his disciples, his students, to do the impossible. He would say to them when they were afraid, he would say, "Fear not, fear not." Again and again, something terrifying would happen, and the disciples would be afraid, and Jesus would look at them and he would say, "Fear not." And the essence of what he was saying was this: while uncertainty in this life is unavoidable, fear is optional. Now, the interesting thing is, Jesus taught on this again and again and again and again. And if we follow the progression of his teaching on it, we see something that I think is both interesting and comforting. His closest followers didn't get it. They didn't get it. They didn't believe it. Initially, his words just sounded like fantasy to them. But then something happened, and it changed the way they saw everything. And today, I want us to follow the journey that the disciples of Jesus went on. I want us to walk with them through the years, the few years of teaching on fear that Jesus gave to them. Because here's what I think. I think fear is still a big issue. I think it is a huge issue for us. And just like Jesus' original followers, we can become very skeptical about his teaching on fear. Because Jesus is saying to you and Jesus is saying to me right now in the midst of whatever we're going through, fear not. And the truth is, we struggle to believe that that's actually possible. So today, I want us to go on a journey with the disciples. Now, the Gospel of Matthew really captures the progression of Jesus' teaching on fear. One day in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus gets all his followers together, gathers his 12, and he says, "Look, guys, we've been together for a while, but today we're going to split into teams of 2. And I'm going to send you out to do a bunch of stuff. And I'm sending you out like sheep among what? Wolves." Now imagine you're a disciple and you're hearing that. You guys fired up for this day? You fired up for this mission? I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Okay, you are the sheep and they are the wolves. I'm sending you out, and eventually some of you are going to get arrested. Some of you are going to get beaten. You're going to get devoured. Some of you, in the end, are going to have to sacrifice a great deal for me. And then he says, "Fear not. Don't be afraid." And then you have to imagine being a disciple. The disciples are like, "What? Sorry, what? You're saying we're going to be arrested and beaten and abused and devoured, but you don't want us to be afraid. Are you serious?" And Jesus was like, "Yeah, I'm serious. You don't have to be afraid." And then he went on to say this. He said, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now imagine you're one of the 12 and you're trying to get your mind around all of this. You're like, "Wait a minute, Jesus. Are we supposed to be afraid or not afraid?" And Jesus is like, "Well, see, the problem is you're afraid of the wrong things. You're afraid of the wrong stuff. Don't be afraid of what can only hurt your body." And then he goes on and he explains a little bit. And the disciples are like, "Thank you, good. We need some explanation." And he says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet, not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care." And he says, "And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered, so don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." And they're like, "That was not helpful." At all, Jesus. Like, Are you saying you're going to keep bad things from happening to us? Because you just said, okay, let's review. You just said we're going to be arrested and beaten and maybe worse. And just so you know, Jesus, the sparrows, they still fall to the ground. So what are you saying? But Jesus is wanting them to connect the dots. Because about 2 chapters earlier, and we don't know how long this was time-wise, but 2 chapters earlier, they had just had an unforgettable experience. And that experience ties into what Jesus is teaching here about fear. Now, this is a very famous story. Many of you are very familiar with this. It's found in Matthew chapter 8. And Jesus is teaching and he's healing, and he's surrounded by this massive crowd. And so the only way for Jesus to escape the crowd and get some time with his guys was to get on a boat. He had to go somewhere that the crowds couldn't follow, right? It's not like Jesus had this sweet posse and they had these 6 tricked out Escalades and they could just roll up and sweep out, right? You can just zoom away from the crowds. The only way was to go where the crowds could not go, which was the lake. So Matthew chapter 8. Then he, Jesus, got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so the waves swept over the boat. Now, the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by all of these hills, and so what can happen is huge storms can roll in almost completely undetected, especially in the first century. And that's what happens. And so here they are, they're on the lake, and the storm is so furious that we're told the waves are sweeping over the boat. Now, I want to pause here because I think many of you can relate to what they were feeling in this moment. Many of you have had terrifying experiences in your life. Maybe it was on an airplane, maybe on a boat, maybe somewhere else, but you've had a time in your life where you thought you might die. There was an experience that maybe came suddenly and didn't last, but you found yourself scared to death of death. I felt this a while back. I'm not going to go into the whole story. I've told it before, and some of you know this story. But a few years back, Jen and I were snorkeling in Mexico, and we got caught in a current while we were snorkeling and couldn't get ourselves back to the shore, or it felt like we couldn't get ourselves back to the shore. And I truly thought we were both going to die. Now, I happened to fight through it, and I made it back. But then I thought, Jen's going to die, and I'm going to stand here and watch her die. Thankfully, a kid on the beach had a boogie board that he was using. There was no lifeguard. There was one family on the beach, a kid with a boogie board. And I went over to him. We got the boogie board. I was able to swim out, get her, and swim around the current and get Jen back in. But it was crazy. And I know some of you know that story. My point is, most of you have your own story. You've been caught in a sudden, life-threatening situation, and you were panicking for your life. So remember that feeling. Remember that feeling, and realize that's where these guys are. This is where these guys are. The waves are so huge, they're sweeping over the boat. And Matthew was there. He's the one that wrote the gospel. He was there. He was in the boat, and he tells us all heck was breaking loose. And get this, he says, but Jesus was sleeping. Really? How in the world could Jesus be sleeping? Seriously, when you think about this story, there's 2 miracles in this story. Now, we're talking about Jesus, and so, of course, I won't put anything past him. But there's a part of me that wonders, maybe he was only pretending to be asleep. I think you guys, some of you know what I'm talking about. If you have kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Right? Something's going on in the room, and you just pretend to be asleep. Right? Because if I'm not asleep and they see me see them, I have to do something about this. So you're totally listening to your kids, and there's all this pandemonium, and they're just shh, shh, mom's sleeping, shh, dad's sleeping. And you're listening to all of it, pretending to be asleep. So I don't know if Jesus was actually sleeping or pretending, but the boat was getting thrashed, and the disciples were panicking. They were terrified that they were going to drown. And they look over at Jesus, and he's asleep. And I think it's such a powerful image because some of you have struggled with your faith at a certain time. There's been a tragedy or an event in your life, and you prayed and you prayed and you prayed and you looked to Jesus and he was asleep. Jesus did not respond the way that you thought Jesus should respond. God did not respond the way you thought God should respond. And you felt like, well, either God doesn't exist, or God is asleep, or God doesn't care. And here's what's interesting about this. All of the disciples had those same feelings. They had them again and again and again. And yet they're the very ones that brought us the message of Jesus. They're the very ones that insisted on him being the Son of God, the ones that laid the foundation for what Christians believe, the ones that insisted that he is the way and the truth and the life. These guys were no strangers to adversity and pain and suffering. And in this particular scene, not only did they imagine that God was asleep, like they looked over and he was literally asleep. And so, you know the story. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" To which, if you think about it, one of them had to have thought, permission to speak freely. Are you serious, Jesus? Are you serious? We're about to drown. Here's how it works. When we're about to drown, we're afraid. What do you mean, why are you afraid? What kind of ridiculous question is that? Then he got up, it says, he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." And the only answer for that question is super. He is a superman. Like in Mark's version of the same story, this is awesome. He writes, "They were terrified and asked each other, 'Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.'" In other words, they were afraid of drowning, but after Jesus rebuked the storm, they were terrified of Jesus. They thought the storm was powerful. Then they saw Jesus and it was like, oh my goodness, who are we in the boat with? Right? And it dawns on them, whoa, Jesus is more powerful and terrifying than the storm. Now, that event had recently happened when Jesus later taught, don't be afraid of what can only kill the body. Be afraid of the one that can kill the soul. Now, I don't think that Jesus is saying to them, hey, you guys know how you're afraid of storms and dying and all that? Well, you should be even more afraid of me. I want you to walk around terrified of me. I mean, that's not the kind of relationship that Jesus offers to us, right? And so I think Jesus is saying something kind of like this. I think he's saying, listen, there is one so much more powerful than anything you've ever experienced on earth. And if you look to him and if you entrust yourself to him, nothing on this earth can ultimately harm you. He's powerful, he's good, and he loves you more than you know. And your soul, your very soul, rests in his care. So you don't have to be afraid. So here they are being sent out now, 2 by 2, and they hear the words of Jesus, and they start to connect the dots. Don't fear the one that can only hurt the body. Don't fear the person. Don't fear the thing. Don't fear the disease. Don't fear the storm. Don't fear the empire in their case. You don't have to fear the things that can only hurt your body. A few chapters later, Jesus, he multiplies the fish and the loaves. And he feeds thousands upon thousands. And it's this unbelievable miracle. And the disciples are blown away. And right after it was over, Matthew says, immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Question. Do you know why Jesus had to make the disciples get into the boat? Because they remembered what happened the last time they got into the boat. So Jesus has to make them get in the boat, but this time he doesn't go with them. He sends them on ahead, and then he goes and he dismisses the crowd while they head out on the lake. And it says, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So the disciples, following the instructions of Jesus, are trying to row to the other side, but they're rowing into this headwind and this current and these waves, and they're tired, and their hands are blistering, and they're soaked, and it's just a mess. And it says, shortly before dawn, okay, in other words, they've been at this all night. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Fail. Fail, fail, fail. You guys failed again. I'm trying to teach you about fear. Didn't we just go through this? Remember, you guys, there was a storm, and you were all like freaking out, and I was asleep, and you guys said, oh, he's asleep, and you were freaking out, and then I calmed the storm, and then you were more afraid of me than the storm. Well, here we are again, on the lake again, and again, you're all terrified. You fail." Jesus is a lot sweeter than that, which is awesome. So he sees them afraid, and he's really tender, and he's walking on the sea, and he says, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." And the disciples are going, "Oh, wait a minute. You weren't with us, but apparently you were like watching over us the whole time." He's like, "Yes, you're getting it. You're getting it. That's exactly it. Because one day, here's the deal, I will not be with you, but you don't have to be afraid because I'll be watching you. And just as you didn't need to be afraid when I was asleep in the boat, just as you didn't need to be afraid when I wasn't with you in the boat, you don't need to be afraid even when you're facing something to be afraid of." And so here's the lesson. The lesson is this: you don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Now we hear that. Fear not, don't be afraid, right? And the disciples are like, "But Jesus," he's like, "No, shh, you don't have to be afraid, even when there's something to be afraid of." And guys, this is exactly what Jesus taught his earliest followers. Now this sounds crazy. It's just ridiculous, right? It sounds crazy, but I want us to ponder this, and I want us to think about this in a way that's kind of personal to us. And so I want us to say that aloud together a couple of times. But instead of saying you, let's make it personal and change it to I. Okay? So I don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. I want us to say that together. I don't have to be even when there's something to be afraid of. One more time. I don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. That's what Jesus taught about fear. You don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Now, here's something that I find really encouraging in the midst of all this. The disciples failed at this again and again and again and again and again. Right up to the very end, in fact, they failed. If you remember this, when Jesus was arrested, what did they all do? They scattered. They ran away, right? Run away, run away. They're all scattering. They're terrified. In fact, Peter, Jesus' right-hand man, denies him 3 times. I don't even know him. They did not fear the one that can only harm the body. They were terrified of the ones that could harm their bodies. Despite all the miracles and all the teaching and all the experiences, when Jesus was finally arrested and all that pressure and there was all that confusion, they were horribly afraid and they all ran away. Peter's response was like the most documented and it's the most famous, but they all ran away. And I want to kind of pause here and I want us to think about what happened that day. I want us to think about the arrest of Jesus and then what followed that. Because what happened next is the foundation of our faith. I mean, Jesus was betrayed by one of his closest friends. He was unjustly arrested in the middle of the night in secret. He was illegally tried and convicted, and the witnesses and the judge were all bribed. And then we're told he was flogged. Now, we tend to just go, oh, okay. Just kind of skip over that. But let's not. Let's not. Here's how it's explained in the first century document, Mark. Mark says, wanting to satisfy the crowd, we'll come back to that, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged. Now, Pilate was the governor of Judea. He was appointed by the emperor of Rome himself, and his job was to keep the peace in the area that he governed. Okay? So his job was keep the peace and raise taxes. Keep the peace and raise taxes from the people. But the crowd had been stirred up by the same men that were responsible for Jesus' arrest and his mock trial. And so to satisfy the crowd, to prevent a riot from breaking out in the region he was called to govern, Pilate ordered Jesus to be flogged. Now, in the story of Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, this being flogged thing is sort of like this small detail thrown in, and like, oh yeah, and by the way, he was flogged. It comes across as this tiny little add-on, but guys, it was a big deal. In fact, if I took the time and I described to you in detail what flogging was like, some of you would become nauseous. Some of you would feel like you need to leave the room, and you might just leave the room. I have to confess to you guys that when I was a younger, much less seasoned pastor, I made that mistake. And I explained what happens with flogging in detail and all the gory details, and it was way too much for people. People literally got sick, and some people had nightmares, and I got emails, and it was a mess. So I'm not going to do that today. Today I'm going to keep it PG-13. But without giving you, all of the overkill and all of the gore, here's what flogging entailed. A skilled Roman centurion, because flogging was something that was a skill. You wanted to bring a person to the point of death without actually killing them. So the centurion would take a whip with leather straps about 6 to 8 feet long, and tied into the leather straps bits of glass and steel and stone. The goal of flogging was to rip the skin off of a person's back and chest and legs one lash at a time. Their hands were tied together and bound to a pole up high, and the purpose was to expose their entire body. And this is what Pilate had done to Jesus in order to satisfy the crowd. After he was flogged, he was taken by the Roman soldiers. And there, the soldiers decided to have a little fun with Jesus. It says, then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Now imagine that on top of his mutilated body. And then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. And if it all wasn't enough, when it was finished, Pilate gave Jesus the death sentence, crucifixion, no mercy. Now, Romans loved to use crucifixion not just to execute someone. Romans love to use crucifixion to send a message, to instill fear. Here's what happens to you if you decide to cross the Roman Empire. Crucifixion wasn't just about killing someone, it was about killing someone slowly, prolonging the agony as long as possible. It was about both pain and shame. And again, if I went into too much detail on this, same thing. Some of you wouldn't be able to handle it. So I'm not going to say too much. But a nail went between the bones in the wrist to suspend the body on the cross. And then another nail went through the feet, usually through the ankles. And the purpose of that nail, the sole purpose of that nail, was to prolong death. Once the body was actually hanging on the cross, what would happen is the shoulders would dislocate. And the body then, in that position, a person wouldn't be able to breathe. So the nail through the feet enabled the body to be able to be pushed up again and again and again to take breath after breath after breath. And eventually, fatigue would set in to the point when the body could not push itself up anymore, and death by asphyxiation would occur. This was a grisly way to die. But the goal of crucifixion for the Romans wasn't just pain, it was also shame. Now, like a lot of Christian art, and we've all seen images of this, crosses are usually raised like way up, and you see them like against the sunset, and they're up really high. But in historical reality, they were usually only about 6 inches above the ground. That way, while people were being crucified, the perpetrators could walk right up to them and mock them right in their face. They would walk right up to them, get in their face, and they would mock them all the way to the point of death. And I think that paints a different picture on maybe some familiar passages. Check this out. It says, those who passed by, they were passing by, and then they came up to Jesus and hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. Those responsible for setting this whole thing up and orchestrating it, they mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. If he's the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross and we will believe in him. And here's the craziest thing about all of this. Jesus walked right into it knowingly. He told his disciples again and again and again that this was going to happen. And then he walked right into Jerusalem or rode into Jerusalem on a donkey in broad daylight. The Romans didn't have to go hunt Jesus down because he was hiding in the cave somewhere. He rode a donkey into Jerusalem in broad daylight. And here's something else that's crazy. When Jesus died, you guys, the movement of Jesus, all that was happening, it should have died with him. When Jesus had his last breath on the cross, that should have been it. It should have just been that's it. It's over. Game over. But what happened, and this is just historically, what happened after Jesus died is the movement of Jesus exploded. It exploded in Jerusalem, and soon after that, it exploded all throughout the entire Roman Empire. History tells us that the followers of Jesus somehow became fearless. It's like somehow they finally got it. Something changed it all. And here's what it was that made all the difference. It was not another lesson. It was not another miracle. It was not another boat ride. It was not another campfire talk with Jesus. It was this. 3 days later, they saw their resurrected Savior alive. And once Jesus rose from the dead, they became fearless. Why? Because the ultimate enemy, death, had been defeated. And when they lost the fear of death, they finally understood what it meant to fear not. Just weeks after the crucifixion, at the risk of his own life, Peter stood in those same streets of Jerusalem and he proclaimed Jesus to the multitudes. Peter would never, ever again deny Jesus, and neither would any of the rest of the disciples. What we see as historical reality is this, and it's staggering. The disciples would give their lives, they would lay down their lives telling the rest of the world about Jesus. Except for the disciple John, they would all be killed for their association with Jesus. They told the world about Jesus and the love of God until it killed them. Peter would actually be crucified under the Roman Emperor Nero. And there's historical evidence that Peter made a really odd request. And this is just interesting, point of interest. Peter, when he was sentenced to be crucified, didn't feel worthy to die the same death as Jesus. So he requested that they crucify him upside down. And then you think about the centurions are like, cool, we don't usually get to do it that way. I mean, you think about the transformation in Peter. You think about the courage. What in the world enabled him to live and to die like that? It's like suddenly the words of Jesus made sense to him. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. And once Peter saw his resurrected Savior, it changed everything. Peter began to live with courage and faith and hope. He lived like a foreigner in this world that was just passing through. He lived like heaven is real, like heaven is forever, and like this life is short. And he taught others to begin to live with that same hope and that same faith and that same peace. And if you look at just the history books, I'm not talking about the Bible, I'm saying look at history books. You see that this faith carried on, and it's extraordinary. In the late 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome. How many of you guys seen Gladiator? Yeah, a little shout out, give us some testosterone. Well, in that movie, Marcus Aurelius was a key character. And it turns out he's a real historical figure. And Marcus Aurelius, as much as he's a good guy in the film, he actually, in real life, oversaw what's considered to be the 4th major persecution of the Christians. So this is like AD 165, 180. This persecution of Christians was going on. And during that time, there became a famous Roman medical doctor, and his name was Claudius Galenus. And Claudius wasn't just a medical doctor, he was also like a historian. And he wrote a bunch of things that have been preserved down through antiquity for us. And in his writings, about a half a dozen times, he mentions Christians and what it was like for them. Now, Claudius himself was not a Christian. Okay, he just writes about them. He was actually anti-Christian. He was opposed to Christians, and he joined with much of the Roman empire to be that way. So he wasn't looking, he's looking at the Christian movement like from the outside as an outsider. But here's what's interesting about being a doctor in that time period. During the time of Claudius, it was actually illegal to examine a dead body. And you think about their religious beliefs and the way that they thought about stuff. It was illegal to examine a dead body. Well, that's tricky if you're a doctor and you're wanting to learn medical science, right? Once a body was dead, they buried it or they burned it. So doctors were not allowed to examine a dead body. So what doctors would do, get this is creepy, they would hang around in the arenas, like places where the gladiators were fighting or where Christians were being tortured or killed slowly or whatever, because they weren't allowed to examine dying bodies, or weren't allowed to examine dead bodies, but they were allowed to examine dying bodies. So this famous writer, who apparently examined lots of dying bodies, examined the dying bodies of Christians during the persecutions. And now get this is not like 20 years after Jesus. This is about 160 years after Jesus. This is several generations later. And Christians are being not just put to death, and you can read up on this, don't just take my word for it, read up on your own. They're being tortured to death, unspeakable things that they're going through. And in his writing, this famous Roman doctor referenced Christians, and here's what he said. For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them every day. For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them every day. He's like, it's amazing. No matter what we put them through or how much pressure we put on them to renounce their faith. And I mean, like we're trying to extinguish this little religious cult, trying to wipe out Christianity. But they have a fearlessness of death and the hereafter. And we witness it every single day. As you think about this, In part, it was the fearlessness of Christians that captivated the Roman Empire. Because those who believed in a risen Savior did not fear death, and they did not fear those that could only kill the body. But fear's a weird thing, isn't it? Fear's a weird thing. Fear is not easily dismissed. This is why people have phobias, right? I don't know what phobias you guys might have. If we had more time, we'd do a little confession time, and I'd love to hear about your phobias. What are you afraid of? But a phobia, the whole idea of a phobia is it's an irrational fear, right? It's a fear of something that isn't actually going to hurt you, and yet you can't stop being afraid. It's really, when you're afraid, it's really, really hard to talk yourself out of being afraid. And I want to share an example with you guys of this in my own life, but this is a little bit embarrassing, and so before I share this, I need you guys to promise not to judge me. Okay? Are we good? Okay. So when I first became a Christian, there was a woman that really invested in me a lot, and she was big into Young Life. How many of you are a little bit familiar with Young Life? Many of you. And so she came to me one day and she said, I want to send you to the most amazing place on earth. I want you to go to Malibu with me. And Malibu is this retreat center for Young Life. It's this amazing place. She said, I'll pay for you to go. Could you carve it out in your calendar? I was like, yes, absolutely, I'll go. So I went to Malibu, and you guys, if you haven't been, it is breathtaking. I mean, it is just one of the most beautiful places you could ever imagine. So I went to this whole experience with her, and I was up there for about a week, and it was fantastic. And we get to the last day that we're going to be there, and she comes to me, and she says, hey, and she's got this goofy little smile. She's like, hey, I just want you to know, I signed you up for something. And I'm like, okay. She's like, well, so in about an hour, you're going to go on the high ropes course. And I'm like, you did what? She's like, yeah, you're going to go on the high ropes course. And I was like, oh, so you're going with me? And she's like, oh, heck no. But I'm going to watch. I'll be there with you the whole way. So I'm like, oh my gosh, because I wouldn't say phobic, but I was not real comfortable with heights. But I'm like, this woman loves me. She is the face of Jesus to me in this season of my life, and she wants me to do this. I'll do this. She paid $800 for me to be here. I'll be a good sport about this. I'll do this. So I put the harness on, and I climb up the thing, and I get up to the top. Have you guys ever noticed when you get up there, it feels a lot higher? So I get up there, and I'm like, okay, I've got to do this. And there's the fear of falling, but there's also the fear of just making a jackass out of myself. So the first part of the ropes course is not all that tricky. Everything's pretty stable. And so I just kind of walked across, and you have the harness, and you have a minute or two to get used to the harness. And then you get to the part that is not so easy. They have a rope that's dangling between two trees, and it's maybe 20 feet up, 25 feet up. It feels like it's about 800 feet up. But it's dangling between these two trees, and it's loose. And they're like, you have to go from this tree to that tree on the rope. I'm like, there's no way. Like, even if I was a trapeze artist, I couldn't. And they're like, well, no, here's what you do. And so they explained it to me from the ground with big smiles. Here's what you do. See that cable that runs across right there? I'm like, yeah, but I can't reach it. And they're like, yeah, that's okay. Just fall forward and catch it. You just fall forward and you catch that, and then keep your feet on the rope, and the rope will kind of spread out, and it'll become taut enough for you to inch your way across. I'm like, are you serious? So I'm standing there, and I look, and there's like 6 more people on the course behind me, and I'm log jamming the thing. And I'm like, oh, man. So I'm like, okay, fall forward. Nah, I can't. I'm like, fall forward. So I fall forward, I catch the thing. I'm like, okay, here we go. So I start to inch across in between these two trees. And I don't know if this has ever happened to you. The fear is kicking in, and the adrenaline's kicking in. And this was a little bit stressful physically. And so I'm like starting to shake. And I'm going across. There's 50 people down there. They're like, oh, yeah, you got this. Like, snot's coming out. I'm just like... And there's a guy right behind me in the line, and he's like, super Young Life guy. And he's just waiting for me, and he's just been prancing across the whole thing, and he's like doing twirls and everything's like, woo. And so he's waiting for me. I'm like, okay, I got to get across and let this super young life guy do this thing. So I finally make it across. I get to the other side, and then you climb up to the highest point, and you stand on a platform, and you're at the end. And so I'm like, well, what do I do now? Did you guys know? Has any of you been on the high ropes course? What do? You have to jump off the platform. So there's a bar hanging way outside of reach, and they're like, you just jump and catch the bar. And this is like the thing, like, how scared were you? Did you catch the bar? You know, I caught the bar my first time. I'm like, ah. So I'm standing on the platform, and I'm like, so you want me to jump and catch the bar? So again, I'm just like, ah. Finally, I'm like, okay, and I jump, and you guys, I caught the bar. I know. Your pastor is a rock star. So I'm hanging from the bar, and I'm like, sweet. Yeah, what do I do now? I'm looking at the people down the line. I'm like, what do I do now? And they're like, let go. I'm like, what? Well, so the harness, right, the safety harness is hooked to a pulley. There's a rope that goes up over, and down at the very bottom, there's a big dude holding onto the rope. He's like, I got you. You look really small to me from up here, man. So I did. I let go, and thankfully the guy didn't let me drop 5 feet and then catch me. He slowly eased me down. So that's all cool. And then I'm on the ground, and I'm trying to, my pride's a little, so the super young life guy behind me, standing on the platform, and he lets out a primal scream, and he beats his chest and does a Tarzan impersonation. He jumps up, does a 360, and catches the bar. And then he's up there, he's just he goes one hand, he's like, yeah! And he's over here going, yeah! And then he's doing one-handed pull-ups. And I'm looking up, I'm like, what? Whatever, man. So, I've thought about that situation, and I'm like, am I just a wuss? You guys, there's a right answer to that. And I've decided, maybe not so much. And I thought about this other guy and how brave he was and how awesome he was. And I'm like, you know why that guy wasn't afraid? Because he was super young life guy. He went to Malibu for 4 weeks every summer. He'd been on this course 100 times. And he had made that same jump 100 times. He had made that jump, and he knew that his harness would hold, and he knew that the guy at the bottom was big enough to lower him down. He knew that this would work because he had done it before. You know why Jesus could say to his followers 2,000 years ago, and why he can whisper through the centuries to you and me, in spite of whatever you're facing, in spite of whatever you're dealing with, in spite of the terror that may grip you because of some circumstance you just found out about? Do you know why he can say to you, don't be afraid? Because he's already spent time on the course. Because he's already made the jump ahead of you. And so he actually knows what's on the other side of death. He knows what it is to go through hell and come out the other side. He knows that life is really, really short. He knows that eternity is really, really long. He knows that this world is filled with pain of all kinds. But he also knows that this world is not our home. He knows that the joy of our real home is awaiting us. And he's saying to us, trust me. Trust me. Fear not. Now, I want to clarify something. When Jesus says, fear not, it's really more of an invitation to us than a command. I mean, sometimes I think we can hear this and we hear Jesus say, fear not, and we start to think, dang it, I'm afraid all the time, me of little faith. And we start to feel afraid because we're afraid. Oh no, I'm afraid. God must be really disappointed. I'm not a very good Christian. And I just want to say, if you're going through something scary and painful, of course you're afraid. You're human. This is what it is to be. Do you remember what Jesus did right before his arrest that night? You guys remember what he did? He went to the garden and he prayed. He prayed again and again, Father, take this cup from me. Father, take this cup from me. Father, take this cup from me. And he was so afraid, we're told that he sweated blood. Fear is a human response to pain and danger. It just is. And Jesus was fully human. But when we begin to trust in Jesus, to really trust in him, then it's possible for something supernatural to begin to happen inside of us, because the Holy Spirit, see, is working with our spirit. And so it's actually possible for this supernatural peace and faith and courage to begin to sweep over us. I mean, Jesus wrestled with fear just like we all do. And yet we also see him riding boldly into Jerusalem. We see him allowing himself to be arrested. We see him refusing to give a defense when he was on trial. We see him refusing to make an appeal to Pilate. And at the end, we see something that absolutely blows my mind. To the ones that were driving nails into his hands and into his feet, we see Jesus praying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Yes, he felt fear, but he also felt love and hope. And while you and I will face fear, love and hope are possible too. And so I don't know what you're facing right now. I don't know what keeps you up at night. I don't know what it is in your life that might even be taking your breath away. But Jesus does. He knows what you're walking through. And his invitation to fear not is based on this. He's with you. He's with you. He sees, he knows, he cares. He's working inside you. He's working all around you. And resurrection power is real. Dead things can come to life. And Jesus is always, always, always working for your ultimate good. He's working right now, and he will continue to work. He will continue to work until all of it is accomplished. My daughter was talking with a friend recently, and she was asked a pretty serious theological question. And she was asked, if God is good, why doesn't he just heal everyone? How come only some people get the miracles? How come only some people get the healing? Then my daughter, who's a sophomore in college, then responded and said, well, what do you mean by being healed? What do you mean by being healed? You mean being healed right now and then living another 10 or 20 years and then dying? Is that what you mean by being healed? What do you mean? And she said, I guess I think of it this way. Everyone who entrusts themselves to Jesus will get complete healing. For some, it may come this week, for some this year, and we ask for that. We ask for that because God wants us to ask for that. He wants us to depend on him and have a relationship with him. And so sometimes that miracle comes, and it comes quickly. But even if it does not, the whole point of Jesus being raised from the dead is to show us that healing is always coming. It's coming. Now, knowing that may not change how we feel the pains of this life, but it can certainly change the way we walk through the pains of this life. And so I've been thinking about what she said, and the main thing I've been thinking is, like, wow, what a great dad I am. Unbelievable. This is the level of discipleship that's happening at Brookview. But the other thing that I've been thinking about is I'm like, dang, you know what? She's right. Jesus knew what he was talking about when he said, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Because there is all kinds of pain in this world, but this world is not our home. And knowing that and trusting that and letting the reality of that wash over us changes everything. It changes everything.